We have come to our third discourse, and we have a fourth one. So the next time, and then we want to celebrate afterwards in the Roadhouse. I would like to start out again with the Gospels, because this is very important for our discourse. Because when we want to judge the papacy or the new pope or the old popes and the church and the individuals in the church, the measure, the fundamental measure and principle are always the Gospels. So we don't want to judge because we are angry or we are frustrated or whatever, but we want to judge in terms of an inner criticism. That means to take seriously the norms of the church itself or of the papacy itself. So we start out with a reading here. I think it is from Matthew 19:23 to 30. Then Jesus said to his disciples, I tell you solemnly, it will be hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Yes, I tell you again, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. The eye of a needle, that is the name for a little door in the wall of Jerusalem. So it was so small that no camel could go through. After in the evening, the big doors were closed, and so if somebody became late, he could crawl on all four legs through that little door, the eye of the needle. Then for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. When the disciples heard this, they were astonished. Who can be saved then? They said. Jesus gazed at them. He gazed at them. For man, he told them, this is impossible. For God, everything is possible. Though there is a little bit hope for the rich people, maybe, because of the power of God. Then Peter spoke. What about us? He said to him, we have left everything and followed you. What are we to have then? Jesus said to him, I tell you solemnly, when all is made new and the Son of Man sits on his throne of glory, you will yourselves sit on 12 thrones to judge the 12 tribes of Israel. Of course, 10 of them were lost, but obviously they are back again. And everyone who has left houses, brothers, sisters, father, mother, children, or land, for the sake of my name will be repaid 100 times over, and also inherit eternal life. Many who are first will be last, and the last first. And then it goes on, in connection to this, the children of this world take wives and husbands, but those who are judged worthy of a place in the other world and in the resurrection from the dead do not marry, because they can no longer die. So there is a connection. Since there is no death in the kingdom, therefore there is no need for marriage any longer in the consciousness of Jesus. No longer die, for they are the same as the angels. And being children of the resurrection, they are sons of God. There's the name of sons of God, which which then his friends gave him. And Moses himself implies that the dead rise again in the passage about the bush, where he calls the Lord the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now he is God not of the dead, but of the living. For to him all men are in fact alive. Some scribes then spoke up. Well put, Master, they said, because they would not dare to ask him any more questions. So the scribes were Pharisees, and the Pharisees believed in the resurrection. The Pharisees believed in the resurrection at that time for 200 years, because under the Maccabees, they were persecuted, the Jews, by the Greeks, and suffered tremendous casualties. The Maccabees was a father and 5 sons, and they were all annihilated. So therefore, at that time, this idea came up that there was a resurrection. And Jesus shares in this. Now, before, the Jewish people did not have a clear thinking. They were about the other life or the kingdom of God or whatever. It was this life, and that one followed the 10 Commandments, and so that was important. And what happened later on, that was not so important. But when Abraham was buried in Hebron, the people said, and his soul went to his forefathers now. Now, the forefathers were in Ur, and Ur was part of Iraq. So there was a difference between the body, which was buried in Hebron, and then the forefathers to whom he was gathered. So there was an inkling already before in the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, and in the prophets and so on, that there may be another life. But it was not very clear. But for Jesus it's very important, and also then for Paul, because Paul later on says, and if the teaching of the Pharisees of the resurrection is not true, what they taught in the last 200 years, then Jesus is not resurrected. And if he is not resurrected, then all what remains is this world, and then we are the poorest of all people, because we don't get anything out of this world, and then there is no other. And so that Paul was a Pharisee still, and he shared this teaching. Okay, so that is now, particularly when we talk about this Pope who chose the name of Francis, this idea of the poor and the rich plays an important role. We had a very good second discourse, and what made it good was the objections which we had. Remember that we talked about feeling good, and our analysis obviously did not make us all feel good. Now, it is important that this is taken serious too in religious language, that to feel good, that one goes to church to feel good with the music and all that, that usually is called consolation. And we all are in need of consolation. We have to die, we get sick, we lose people, and so on. So one should not look down on this consolation. But the Enlighteners, particularly the great thinker Immanuel Kant, thought that if this consolation then leads to a weakening of conscience, that then it is opium religion. I reluctant, and that's okay. Welcome to the club.
Yes.
Now we are more than 3. That's wonderful. So the Holy Spirit is already there when only 3 are there. Now we get more of the Spirit. Okay, I just mentioned the last time that in our discourse we had an objection. And objections are very important because they drive the discourse forward. And the objection was that we come into the church in order to feel good. And there are a lot of feel-good churches, and they are very successful. So, but there is nothing to look down upon, because we all need consolation, but it becomes dangerous when this consolation somehow dumps down or annihilates or neglects the conscience. And when that happens, then we call that opium religion. So Immanuel Kant, the great thinker, was the first who called that opium religion. And then another thinker, Hegel, applied that to Hinduism. And then another great thinker, Marx, talked about the opium of the people. And people usually know that. When they know something about Marx, they say, well, this is the guy who said, religion is opium for the people. But we have to know where it comes from and what exactly it means. It is not necessarily a religion, against religion, but it is against religion which helps people to live close to slums, like down here on the other side of the railroad station, with a good conscience, who see that we have a class system which is a great tragedy, and they have a good conscience. Or they vote down the food stamps for 4 million people, and they have a good conscience. Or they vote for health care for 20 million people, and they have a good conscience. So that is then bad religion. There is good religion, is there bad religion. But it doesn't make it bad that when people want to feel good and want to be consoled. That is very human, and the religion should console. But it must not somehow weaken the conscience, so that people can live side by side of horrendous conditions. Or let's see, we will talk about this later on, as far as the what is it, this old strike business and so on. and one hears that every day, and nothing happens in us, and the churches are saying nothing, and so on. So that is when it becomes dangerous. So our analysis, which we had so far, made us somehow feel less good, and that is to be expected. And then comes the faithfulness, if we want to go through the analysis, or if we rather want to give it up. You have that also in psychoanalysis. In psychoanalysis, for instance, you know that people in the middle of the psychoanalysis, they give up, they run away, because the analysis, the closer the analysis comes to the truth, the more people then would like to run away. Or they get the feeling of doomsday, or the feeling of pessimism or so. Pessimism and optimism is, by the way, a psychological thing, and the Pope was asked about this, Francis, and he said he didn't want to use those words. He rather wanted to replace them with hope instead. So are you optimistic? Not optimistic, but are you hopeful or not? Which is a different thing from being optimistic. But an analysis can be hard, and if we have students who study medicine soon on our campus, they will study anatomy and physiology, and that is fine. But they will also have to study pathology, and that is where many of them may run away and say, this is not for me, this whole thing. So something similar goes on also as far as we are concerned. So let me repeat again that consolation is not wrong. We don't come in order to feel bad. We don't come in order to have doomsday feelings or whatever. But we have to see that consolation must not dull our conscience, so that we live comfortably in the midst of much suffering. If consolation dulls conscience, we have opiate religion. We have bad religion. We reject opium religion. We do not reject consolation. Religion must sharpen our conscience. So far, Pope Francis has promoted a religion which sharpens conscience for the tragedy of class societies, which Christianity had declared to be unnecessary from the very start. So when we say, you know, we are in a class society, and then we say, so what? That would not be religious. Christianity was fully aware of the tragedy of class societies. Many were slaves. Many were poor people. As a matter of fact, there were only very few patricians or so in the slaveholders in the Christian community. So, and Christianity thought and brought this into history, that these class societies are a fact, but they must not be. It must not be that way. It can be changed. That is the hope which Christianity brought, and the new Pope, is somehow closely related to this. So what we promised ourselves the last time is we want to connect our discourse with things which are going on right now. And so I want to take just a few little ones and do it fast. Something horrendous has happened in my diocese in Frankfurt. It's the Diocese of Limburg, and it just has happened yesterday or so. The Bishop Franz Peter Thebarts van Elst is a bishop from the nobility. He has still a noble title. It's just unbelievable. When I read this, it makes me feel funny already. Franz Peter Thebarts van Elst. This Bishop of Limburg, that was my diocese in which I grew up, has bought himself a house of $40 million and a bathroom of $10,000 and a chapel with a warming ceiling on top there for another $20,000 and so on. And the Pope heard about it and he threw him out. He was suspended. This diocese had another trouble before. There was a bishop maybe 10 years ago. When I came for vacations there, I preached in my church in Frankfurt, which was part of the diocese there. So, and this man, this bishop, it was like opposite. So he lived poor in a simple house and all this, but he got in trouble about birth control. In Germany, you have a very close cooperation between the church social agency and the secular social agencies. And so there was the question if a Catholic social agency could recommend to a person birth control, artificial birth control, because there were many children, or the 2 children could not be paid for, or there was illness or whatever. It was a struggle between the bishop and the Benedict XVI, which went on, and there was suspension was also threatened at that time, but the bishop gave in against his conscience, by the way. He thought that the secular side was right, and nevertheless, in order not to bring disunion into the church, he gave up, and after many months of struggle, and then so he was never suspended. But this one was suspended. He was called to Rome. He could not fly in a very luxury liner, in a business class. He had just been in India, and there he flew in a huge there is another class beyond the business class. So he flew in the super class. It cost him also thousands of dollars and so on. So the Pope made sure that he did get a very inexpensive trip to go to Rome, and there he had already have an hour of discussion. He does not know exactly what. He may be fired completely, and it's interesting that also the people of the Diocese of Limburg are also horribly upset. They said he is a catastrophe, this guy, and he has to go. So the Pope and the masses of the people, their conscience, that is it, their conscience was awakened. That should not happen anymore. Now, Germany is a very rich country, and there are a lot of people with $40 million homes or whatever, but a priest should not be that. He should not belong to that. So here we have the priest has to side not with the bourgeoisie, but with the other side, with the proletariat, or they call it now precariat. Precariat. That means somebody who lives a precarious existence. Somebody who has 2 children in a family and has $22,000 or whatever, what we have as a poverty line. So whatever is under this poverty line. But so that is an interesting type of a decision. And that is what we are about here in our discourse, to see how he is doing. So there, he's doing very well. By what standards? By biblical standards. We had the reading the last time, the old couple who sold things or didn't sell them really, and cheated on that, and didn't join the communism and so on. By the way, this is not a communistic position. The Pope does not deny the right to property or whatever. He simply thinks that people who are living in terms of the gospel, that they should not do these things which the bishop does there. So, and there are other criticism which has come out already. He thinks that somebody has the vow of poverty, as he has it, or the vow of chastity, that they should not become sterile bachelors or sterile spinsters, but that they should become fertile, but in another way. That means that they should be productive. So not having big houses, but rather probably productive. By the way, before I go to the next thing, let me say something here which shows some light. It's not easy to get the profile of a man like this, right? So he has a long career as a Jesuit already. He's the first Jesuit, we said. He had leading positions in the Jesuit order. He was the head of whole provinces, and he confesses today when he was asked by a journalist recently, who would you say, who are you? And he said, I'm a sinner. And well, sometimes one says this, but then he makes it more concrete. When he was 30 or so, he became the head of the order in Brazil. And today he regrets deeply that he was authoritarian, that he was an authoritarian personality, that he did not consult people adequately. The Catholic Church is an authoritarian church, we know this, right? And so he grew up in this church, and he became like many of the leaders are. So an authoritarian personality, that comes from Erich Fromm, the critical theorist of the Frankfurt School, and he described that authoritarian personality. In fascism, you had authoritarian personalities. Erich Fromm made a study of German workers, I don't know, 10,000, 18,000 or whatever, before Hitler came to power, and he found out that about 12% were authoritarian personalities, about 12% were revolutionary revolutionary personalities, which later on he called democratic personalities. And in the middle was somehow swinging back and forth between the two sides. And on this study, they could predict if Hitler would win or not, because the fascist government needs a lot of authoritarian personalities. What is an authoritarian personality? It is somebody who's romantic, who thinks that the old Mass, for instance, before the Vatican Council is better than the new one. Or he thinks the good old times were the Middle Ages. Or the good old times were the antiquity. So it's romantic in that sense. And the authoritarian personality is also nationalistic. Right or wrong, my country, if we do these drone strikes, that is okay. If somebody else would do them, then we would say this is a war crime. So that is nationalism. Or also pro-capitalistic, but not in the sense of capitalism, as a private appropriation of collective labor, but capitalism as having leaders, like Ford, who is able to put 70,000 men in Detroit under his control and put them at the assembly line. He even beat them up. He had thugs who came there and beat him up. But the idea is that masses cannot lead themselves, that masses have no meaning. Masses are zeros, and you have to put a one in front of it, and then they get substance and so on. So that Ford and Hitler had that in common. You need the great man, and they were great men in politics. And Hitler thought he was one of those great men, and they were great men in economics. And so Ford and Rockefeller and so on, they were the great men in economics who gave meaning to the masses by sacrificing themselves at the assembly line or by sending them into war. So, and then also the authoritarian personality is sadistic against people who are below. That means races which are considered to be inferior, or men toward women, and so on. So aggressive, sadistic feelings, or masochistic, upward toward more powerful people. So Hitler was masochistic in terms of providence and fate, which did this to him, and so on. At the same time, he kicked downwards to the minorities, and so on and so on. It is originally sexual, but it can be separated from sexuality, and then it constitutes the authoritarian character. And the authoritarian character is sometimes racist, not always. Hitler was very racist. Mussolini was a little bit less racist. Franco was a little bit less racist than Mussolini and Salazar and the Romanian fascists and so on. They were not all equally fascists, and they did not all equally participate in the annihilation of Jews. They all sent Jews somehow to the concentration camps, but some of them did. Pavlovich in Croatia sent a lot. He had 2 huge concentration camps and so on. And the sad thing, Pavlovich, there was a fascist state, Croatian state, the Ustasha state, and you can see pictures there today, the priests marching, the nuns behind it, and then in a huge fascist procession with the Ustasha and so on. And they have come back in the church, they have come back in 1989 with the neoconservative counter-revolution. So, nevertheless, what I want to say, which is important because studying the Pope today a little bit more intensely, he is, of course, as a Jesuit, he thinks very much of Ignatius of Loyola. Ignatius of Loyola went to the university, and in the university he met people who then started the order. One of these Jesuits was Faber, who has been canonized in the meantime. So there is a whole group of early Jesuits, first generation, the Pope is very much intimate with in his thinking. But the interesting thing is that he does not like so much the asceticism of the Jesuits. Asceticism is the science of our will to life, the Gautama, the Buddha, the enlightened one, discovered that all life is suffering. And where does it come from? It comes from the will to life, from our libidinous, loving, life-friendly forces inside, and of the aggressive ones, the killer instinct. And so the Gautama introduced a science, how to deal with the will to life, how to study the will to life. So when you sit on television and they suddenly show you some food, and unconsciously you march to the refrigerator and take something out in spite of the fact that you had enough already. So that is the will to life. If you, for instance, live in celibacy and you are not married and you repress your sex, it comes out in somewhere else, that you want to have more property or that you want to dominate people and so on. So it is a very complicated science to study how the will to life is working. And then methods how to, and some are strange, to stand on one foot for a week, or to hang yourself on a tree, or to bury yourself sometime, or not to speak of fasting, of course, and celibacy and so on. So that was developed in Buddhism and in Hinduism, and it came from there to the West. And some of the orders, you know, flagellati, the people who beat themselves up there, for instance, they are bloody because of their sinfulness and so on. All that can be very, the Opus Dei group, for instance, who is this right-wing businessman group, they flagellate themselves, and some of them in extreme asceticism. So the Pope does not want to have anything to do with this asceticism, which is a very good sign for him, but he is more concerned with mysticism. So monasticism came from the East into the Abrahamic religions. It was not there. Then this monasticism in form of the Sufis, for instance, in Islam, in form of the Kabbalists in Judaism, in form of the Catholic and Protestant mystics, Jakob Böhme and so on, it penetrated the three Abrahamic religions. It penetrated because of the parousia delay, because of the Messiah not coming. And instead of waiting and being frustrated and he doesn't come, for the Jews, he is waiting already, they wait already 2,800 years, and the Christians wait 2,000 years, and the Muslims wait already 1,400 years, and so that is, instead of that, the mystics are people who say, we can be in God now, and God can be in us now. And then whatever the kingdom of God will be, we can accomplish already with our own work. And then when the Messiah comes, he will put the signature underneath what we have done already. And then it's only one step from mysticism to the modern enlightenment, to the bourgeois enlightenment, the socialistic enlightenment particularly, where people would say, well, if the Messiah only has to put his signature underneath what we already do, then it is not so important anymore if the Messiah comes or not. This is the result, this country is the result of the bourgeois enlightenment, and there are more and more people who are not really waiting that every second can be a little gate through which the Messiah will enter, as the old Jews believed in, as Jesus believed in. So now the Ignatius of Loyola got this mystical thing, not the asceticism, but the mystical thing from a great Catholic mystic, namely Meister Eckhart. Meister Eckhart. We don't know him because he was excommunicated. We have excommunicated great people who are all in heaven, I think. But this Meister Eckhart, a very educated person in terms of all the great thinkers of antiquity, and the church fathers, and of course the Gospels and the Torah, and of course Aristotle and Plato and so on. He had an unbelievable influence. He was charged by the Holy Inquisition, which is an institution in the church which was developed when the church began to fall apart. We are here, we have 1,200 different Christian churches. And when that appeared, that there would only be 2 or 3 Luther and Calvin and Zwingli or whatever, or when these names, or Wycliffe 100 years earlier, or Hus 100 years earlier, people were so frightened and they thought, how can we, the church together? So the purpose of the Holy Inquisition was to keep the church, the unity of the church. But you cannot use bad means in order to reach good goals. The good goals do not sanctify the bad means. And when I say bad means, not only that they are morally bad now, they are also technically bad, because the Inquisition has probably intensified the disintegration of Christianity rather than keeping it together. So this Inquisition charged Eckhart, Master Eckhart, with certain deviations from the dogma. And he wrote a big defense, and we have this defense. And after the defense was done, the Inquisition dropped the case. So he was introduced into the church. But then when he was dead, the Inquisition started another procedure, and now he could not defend himself anymore. And so what was the charge? And that is what I want to mention now, because that is interesting as far as the new Pope is concerned. The charge was pantheism. All idealists are under that charge of pantheism. What does pantheism mean? It means that God and nature are one, that God and the creation are identical. And that would be indeed a heresy if Meister Eckhart really had taught that. But he did not teach it. What he taught was that God is in all things, that all things are in God, but that did not mean that God was all things, if that is what pantheism teaches. So Hinduism is pantheistic, Buddhism is pantheistic, the Greeks were pantheistic. Paul went to Athens and he talked on the Areopag, a place where philosophers came together and where other people met. But philosophers were sitting there all the time, and St. Paul discussed with Epicureans and Stoics, two philosophical schools. And there, in order to convince them, he quoted Greek poets who had taught exactly that. God is in all of us. God is in all things. All things are in God. And Paul took that as an example and said, they knew it already. They knew it. So I tell you now who this God is. You have an altar in front of your city for the Theon Agnoton, and that is the unknown God. I bring you now the message about this unknown God. Unfortunately, they did not accept Paul. They thought he was what is this little jungle bird?
Parrot?
Parrot, yeah, parrot. He spoke 3 languages, Paul. So he spoke Hebrew, Aramaic, and then he spoke Greek because he grew up in Tarsus, the Greek city. And then he also spoke Roman because he was a Roman citizen. But his Greek may have been a little bit flawed. That may have been the case. But also as far as the content is concerned of what he said, because he talked about the resurrection of the body, and the Greeks wanted to get rid of the body as soon as possible because the body suffered, the body was old, the body has to die. So when Socrates was told, let's bribe the government, all democracies can be bribed, of course, so let's bribe the guy, and then you can go to Sparta or you can go to Thebes or whatever, and can live. And he said, why the hell should I do that? For 70 years I have tried to get rid of this body. Now the government does this nice thing to me and wants to poison me, so now why should I go back? They helped me to reach what I always wanted to reach. So now somebody came and said that this body was to be glorified and transfigured in a new way, and the Greeks didn't like that at all. So all the professors of the University of Athens, up to 527 or so, nobody had converted. Nobody converted, because the New Testament, the Gospels are written in Koine Greek. That means like Politean Greek, what they speak on the other side of the railroad station, or in all our slums. That is not exactly the English which they speak in the palace in Rome, in London. So that and the Christians, since they came from the proletariat, they spoke this, and they also, when they wrote the Gospels in Damascus and Alexandria, they were written and so on, maybe a generation or two after Jesus had died already. That was in that kind of a Greek, and the professor said this is not good Greek, and but also because of the content and of the message about this resurrection thing. They thought that in us as animal organisms, as mammals, which we are, that something happened in us, namely the breakthrough of thought, the breakthrough of spirit, and that is what survived. But as far as the animal body is concerned, it would die like all the other animals. So when Bertolt Brecht says we die like the animals, they would have said partially, yes, but there is something in us which makes you, Brecht, into a poet, namely the breakthrough at a certain point, maybe 1.5 million years ago when we separated from the chimpanzees. That in us, this spark, the mystics would call that the little spark, the little light in us, this light will be saved, it will be superseded into God's Spirit and so on. So this idea that the body would also participate in this and would be transfigured, that was strange to the thing. But I don't want to go into that, but the point of this panentheism, because the Pope has said in an interview recently that he was against this or that because that was an undifferentiated type of a pantheism. But he did not say that if this pantheism would be differentiated, that means that one would say God is in this world and this world is in God, but that they are not the same, that there is identity and non-identity at the same time. When the Inquisition hit at Eckhart a second time, they thought he said identity without differentiation. And that's what I wrote many times already for the Romans too, that the Inquisition misunderstood that. They could only think, is it identical or is not identical? But Eckhart said it is identical, God and the world, and non-identical at the same time. And that is something which is acceptable. So, but Eckhart had a great influence on Martin Luther. He had a great influence on Ignatius of Loyola and his friends. And there is a text which I have from an interview which the Jesuits gave him, where he, step by step, without calling names or so, presents this idea of a panentheistic idea. That means God is in this world. We can find God in history, in the historical process. When you ask me if I am what I think about the homosexuals, who gives me the right to be judgmental? But you have to see that in the context. He said, God is at work in this world. He is at work in every life. And he is at work in the life of this homosexual, of this lesbian. Who am I to judge what God is doing in the life of this person? And when I become obsessed then with homosexuality, or obsessed with birth control or whatever, then I miss the whole point. So that means the Meister Eckhart influenced then also not only Ignatius of Loyola, not only Luther, but also he's the father of German idealism, that means from Kant to Hegel, but also of proletarian idealism, and that is the whole Marxist thing. And the man who put that together was Erich Fromm. And Erich Fromm has already been quoted by the popes. And also two friends of his, Horkheimer and Adorno, have also been, by Ratzinger, they have been quoted in the last encyclical. And a pope usually only quotes other popes. So when they suddenly go out and look at those people there who come from Eckhart and to the Frankfurt School and so on, that is unusual. And the theologian in Montreal has been, how did that happen, that he suddenly quotes those two people? So that means there is something breaking through there. If this Pope will ever take Eckhart back into the church, I don't even think it matters. He is now 800 years excommunicated. It is about time, the poor man, but I think he is in a very safe place, so whatever they will do in Rome will not matter very much. So therefore, so the line of somehow cultural connection is between between Meister Eckhart and Ignatius of Loyola, but also the Protestants. He has not said very much. He has said a lot about getting together with the, overcome the schism, to get together with the Orthodoxy. Next month I will go to the Ukraine. That is where the Orthodox bishops are. So he wants to talk with them, but hopefully he will open up also to the Lutherans and so on and talk with them as well. He also has not said much about talking with the modern world yet, so, but one cannot expect all of it. But this is a very important thing now, that if he emphasizes the mysticism of Ignatius of Loyola, the looking out for the always greater God, for the God beyond God, the God who is at work in the historical process, so that, like the great philosopher Hegel, you can see God at work in the morning news. You can see him at work on television, how he step by step, his providence is at work. And you can see it also in the life of every person, how God's providence is at work there. And you can see it in those people who have to have an abortion, in those people who have to get divorced, or the people who, whatever they do. How can you judge when you are not really open for what providence is doing in the individual people? So this, what is called panentheism, is behind his thinking and behind his talking, and in many, many versions as that comes through, meditation and all these things. So if that really comes through, then there is real hope, even if the Pope had a time when he was an authoritarian personality, even when he acted toward his brothers without consulting them. When they elected him, they gave him 6 cardinals who are by his side continually, and he has to consult them all the time. The council promised that there will be collegiality, that the Pope has to make his decisions with the bishops and so on, and that was not obeyed. And he does not even want to talk about the Second Vatican Council. He said the Second Vatican Council is a given. We don't have to discuss that anymore. We will not go back behind the Vatican to it. So when Benedict, as you know, allowed the old Mass again, well, it was always permitted, but he enforced it that it would be celebrated more and more. And the new Pope said, well, what Benedict did, it was fine, it was a wonderful Mass and so on, but if it becomes a weapon for right-wing Catholicism, then it has no place. So there are good indications about, and we must see dialectically that there are good things going on, while also very dangerous things are going on. For instance, yesterday, or day before yesterday, the Pope rejected that people who are divorced and remarried can go to communion. You know that there's a great problem. There were 144 theologians last year who went to Benedict, and one of the points of their reform decree, which they submitted to the Pope in Germany when he was in Berlin, was this, that one should relax that. That one should, when people are divorced and then they marry again, and the marriage goes well, and they help each other for many years or so, that it would be utterly unfair to withhold the communion from them. But unfortunately, the Curia, not the Pope personally, but the Curia reinforced yesterday that this has to be held on to. I think if anybody breaks it, that the right may be on their side. We have to ask the Gospels. Did Jesus exclude anybody? Well, anybody that was Judas. Did he share with Judas his body and his blood, or did he withhold it? There are different reports, but one thing is the one who puts the hand spread with me into the wine, he is the one who will betray me. And then now Judas, go and do fast what you have to do. It is not entirely clear, and there are long discussions if Judas participated in the Last Supper. But the Last Supper is what Jesus left behind before he died, and that we should remember him. and it is the core of love in the church. And whoever is excluded from this is a scandal. Recently a scandal happened. There was a bishops' meeting in Rome, and the Orthodox, the patriarchs, were invited. The forest would mean the love of God and the love of the neighbor. When over these things like homosexuality or whatever, you lose this idea of love, then if I throw my son out because he's a homosexual, then I may be informed with the book Leviticus, but I am violating the very core of Christianity, which means love your neighbor, and my son is my neighbor, and so on. So that I think may help, that he, and the right has already, also here in this country, has already criticized the Pope for not taking seriously enough those things they are obsessed by. But I think that this holistic view, this Catholic view, that means holism means, of the Pope is the more progressive type of a thing. We have to think, of course, about the natural law, and if you want to hold on to it, but we have already also, St. Augustine, gave us the 7-point just war theory. Bush used it, but the Church is more and more withdrawing from it because of the new weapons, like the what we talked about, the drones, but particularly the atomic weapons and so on. One paragraph of this Augustinian just war theory is, never can you hit when you hit civilians, then it cannot be a just war. So they give it up and they go back to the Gospels. And according to the Gospels, there are no just wars. Augustine introduced the idea that there could not only be unjust, but there could also be just wars. And then with him, it starts that Catholics then can be army chaplains, and Catholics can serve the arms and so on. There were two farm boys in Germany who resisted being drafted to the war because they were Christians. And the priests went with them to the execution, and they told them that the state was right and they were wrong. So perverse it can get. Like that priest there who blessed the atomic bomb which was thrown on Hiroshima. Then he had a few days, and he saw that 70,000 people had been killed there and so on. And he blessed the second bomb too. There you see, this is horrifying. That is a total annihilation of Christianity. Now, the priest who did that in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the bomb, he did repent later on, before he died. He said he had been conditioned, he had been brainwashed by the army. Now, how far that is true, that's another question, but he became a peace person later on. So, this prophetic function of the Pope, the papacy, the bishop is a very hard one. We are not martyr material. See, and nobody, in the old church, nobody had to volunteer for martyrdom. If they didn't catch you, and they didn't ask you or whatever, you didn't have to go there and say, I don't want to sacrifice, I don't want to sacrifice. It was only when the courts were forcing you, and, like with Thomas More, by the way, here. Thomas More was very careful, to deny the supremacy oath to Henry VIII. He did not really volunteer. He promised his wife, his second wife, and she said, man, we need you, your children need you, don't do this, and so on. Did not volunteer, but when he was dragged before the parliament and so on, and they asked him outright, then he could not avoid it anymore. So therefore, one should not be, one should consider the costs of the human costs for one's family, one's job, and so on and so on. My predecessor, the Jesuit, Father Harden, was fired here, So we are not living in an easy environment neither here when you take Christianity really seriously.
Rudy?
Okay, yeah.
If you take, like Hans Kuhn's claim seriously that somehow one has to reform the church, especially to the Gospels or even to the Jerusalem church, doesn't that somehow make Leviticus normative for the church? But then again, how binding can Leviticus be in light of the Gospels on the church?
Well, the church thinks that the covenants of the Jews the first Abrahamic covenant and the Mosaic covenant, that they are still valid. So Jesus established a new covenant, but the new covenant supersedes the old ones, but the old ones are still preserved. So the Jews are the older brothers, and we, like them, have a covenant with God. So it is also considered, as Muhammad did too, that is inspired, right? It is divinely inspired. So Muhammad thought that the New Testament is inspired by the Holy Spirit, and also the Torah. But in spite of the fact that, then Muhammad did take some things out. So, for instance, the story of Sodom, the incest story later on, Lot sleeping with his two daughters, that could not be revelation. Something like that would not be revealed by God. So then some Jew had to put it in, injected it, and so on. So he threw it out. And the same thing with God would never do this to a good man like Jesus, to let him being tortured like this, and so on. So he simply negated this. So what the church will do with Leviticus, or could do, which some rabbis have done in New York and so on, to see what the context was of this, a man should not lay with a man like with a woman, death penalty. So what was the context? What was it put against? Already the fact that you have such a horrendous law with such a terrible punishment shows that the temptation to have homosexual relations must have been tremendously great, right? One wouldn't have such a law if it wasn't such a great temptation, and so on. So, but one could say, maybe it was not all homosexuals, but maybe there was at that time, there was male temple prostitution in matriarchal temples in the Near East, and that's what some rabbis, open rabbis would say, and one could explore that if that was really so. Because if you have a law in the Torah or which is based in a context, and the context disappears, the law has no basis anymore. So the Jews have 313 mitzvot, laws, and one law is the high priest has to marry a virgin. Well, since the year 70, there is no temple, no high priest, no sacrifice, and we are running out of virgins as well. So therefore, it has no context anymore. The context is gone. So if one can say something like that, but it has to be explored, it must be honest. One cannot simply make it up. And the story itself, the law itself doesn't say, it doesn't mention the context. Or the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, it looks as if homosexuality, the word homosexuality is not used in the story of Sodom. And Isaiah does not think it was homosexuality. Isaiah thought, 800 before, he thought it was the women of Sodom did not share their wealth with the poor. That was an interesting thing. And Jesus thought that he said the men of Sodom will have it good on Judgment Day in comparison to the men of Sidon who do not repent. He thought they could have repented. They didn't have much time to repent. The fire came very fast. But first, Jesus, it was a sin for Jesus, there's no doubt, because otherwise you don't have to repent. So, but he thought they could have repented, and they could have made it after all. So, but the original story, the messengers, every messenger has a function. So the messenger who told Abraham that he would have a child dropped out. So there were only two then who presented the catastrophe. And that after collective bargaining, with Abraham and Yahweh. If there are 50 people, will you still destroy it? You are a God of justice, See, real religious people can argue, at least in Judaism, with God. You are a God of justice. You do not want to destroy just people. In the end, he destroyed just people anyway, because the children of Sodom, they were all both. They were heterosexual and homosexual, were married. All the daughters, except two of Lot, were married. So therefore, what about the children? And nobody mentions them. There must have been a lot of them. So, but nevertheless, one can say how they behave there. They go and want to see those strangers, and they want to sleep with them, obviously. But then one could say it was a crowd of people, so it looked like a group rape. So then you could specify the law, and you could say it did not really forbid homosexuality, but it was just against rape, group rape. So like people very often say, no, this was not sex. Rape has nothing to do with sex, it has something to do with power. But in reality, it has something to do with power and with sex, both of them. So, but the question is, can the church find a way where they said, this, they could also say maybe these people didn't have the right appreciation between friendships between men and women like the Greeks had, and therefore they talked that way. We went to Father Martin down here in St. Augustine Parish with my class, and he thought, that there could of course be a very deep friendship between two men or two women and so on. It is just, just another category. It's another category than marriage or gay marriage or whatever. So, but such friendships, they can be very serious. I have friendship with people in Germany. We are friends for 60 years. They were with me in the Air Force and so on. And when I go to Frankfurt and they come, it is as if we had never separated and so on. But it has nothing to do with homosexuality or homosexual marriages. So why that should not be possible, So we have to see what, and we are concentrating on the Pope now, what he will say. I think in general he will not change. Of course, he cannot change all things which have been made dogmas. After a dogma is made, the discussion ends. But you can still reinterpret the dogma. You can interpret it in a new way. No matter if these dogmas are about matters of faith or ethical things. The Church does not want to go back. It can only go forward. So there is no dogma against birth control. Therefore, it can still be discussed. There is no dogma against women priesthood. Therefore, it can still be discussed. If the last Pope says we don't discuss it, John Paul II, we are not allowed to discuss it, and we have to tell the Pope what Paul told to Peter, I withstood into his face, Pope, you're wrong. According to the law of the Church, any dogma, any teaching can be discussed until a dogma is, all believers. The Pope, by the way, talks about the infallibility of all believers. That means we all together, not the Pope alone, or even the Pope and the bishops, we all participate in this infallibility of fundamental teachings, like God has created the world, God has become man, and so on and so on. So the Pope is a Christian like everybody else, and he is under the law. The Pope is not above the law. Well, for 1,000 years, the canon lawyers have fought in order to get the Pope, put the Pope on his place. If you have such a high position like this, and there are great dangers that you will take over and abuse it, and it has been abused again and again. Therefore, wherever the Pope is not in conformity with the Gospels, people have to stand up. Prophets in the Church have to stand up and challenge the papacy or the bishops or whatever. It was something prophetic when he went with this Peter Tipparts, one Elst, there in Limburg, there with his $20,000 bathtub. And hopefully that will continue, and that bishop will never see a bishop's seat again. Okay, do we still have a little bit of time? Okay, let me just do the next thing there with survival there. One thing, when we feel, that we don't feel so good anymore because of our analysis, but when it gets serious and so on, then I think we can take solace and can take consolation from what the Catholic Church and what both the Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant brothers and sisters, what they went through, but particularly the church to which the Pope belongs there. That means the Roman Catholic Church went through more trials than any other organization which we really know. And let me just mention a few things here. There was Attila the Hun there. He penetrated Europe, came from Asia. My Russian friends there, they always were in the way. They kept all the Asian attacks back. When we say to the Russians, when they go to Moscow or so, Dustin and I, we were there, or go to Yalta or whatever, if we call the Russians, they are not European and so on, we do a horrible, horrible injustice to them. Europe would not exist without the Russians, who kept all these Attilas away there. But nevertheless, in the century, one broke through, Attila, and then in the 12th century, then another Genghis Khan broke through, and the Russians couldn't keep him back. But Italy was at that time, the Roman Empire had broken down. There was representation of the emperor in Constantinople, but he was too weak. He couldn't do anything. By the way, they recently have made a new document, which is called the Ravenna document, as the beginning of talking with the Eastern churches and so on. But the only one who could defend Italy was the Pope there, Leo, and he had no troops or whatever. So he was riding out with a little white horse into the Piave River, into the middle of the river, and there met Attila on the horse. And they talked with each other in the middle of the river. And miraculously or whatever, Attila withdrew. It's possible that he was tired anyway. Well, he went back to the Danube and got married and had a heart attack in his wedding night there. Heaven knows how many times he got married. So nevertheless, he died, and so no leader anymore. The Huns went back where they had come from. So then, of course, Islam, right? So Islam was a tremendous threat. It grew tremendously fast, the 17th century up to the year 1000 or so. On the intellectual level, great Islamic theologians like Averroes, Aristotelians, they made attacks, and the center was Paris, where the theologians were, and without Thomas Aquinas learning from Averroes and writing this book, Contra Gentiles, against the pagans, which were the Islamic people, but in such a way that he lets Averroes and all the others, Aristotelians, he lets them talk page and page and page, and then he puts his counter-argument against it. And up to today, up to the great philosopher Habermas today, it's a great accomplishment of real discourse. And so by doing the same thing with the New Testament, which the Muslims had done with the Holy Quran, namely by interpreting it now through Aristotle, the church was rescued intellectually, and then the armies threw out the Muslim armies out of Spain. And so that is how Europe became not Islamic, but Christian, and Hitler would have been, he said so, would have been happier if the Islamic people had won, because they don't have that holding up of the other cheek. That is why our Malcolm X here in Lansing also converted to Islam, because when you have the white police dogs coming, you shouldn't hold up the other cheek. That's not the right way. So. And the Christians have not held that fourth commandment anyway. Okay, so that is the Islamic threat, and it was settled. Then there is a schism, right? There was in Frankfurt, there was a council of Frankfurt, and the icons, were suspicious for the West, and they thought idolatry was involved. And so they ruled out the icons, and 200 years later, the schism was complete. But the schism was only a split in the organization. It was not a split in teaching, as it is with our Protestant sisters and so on.
Really?
So, yes.
Isn't there the issue of the filioque?
No, that wasn't. Yeah, the Easterners, the Holy Spirit only comes from the Father, and the West taught from Father and from the Son, the filioque, but that didn't amount to a heresy. It was never considered to be a heresy between the two. One could either say one or the other, and both was okay, as long as the Holy Spirit came out in the end. So then the schism was up to the day. I told you the story where this patriarch is excluded from the communion, and everybody, Father Ken, we talked about, he said, this is a scandal. We are aware of what we do to them and what they did to us, and our crusades, the crusades we did not only to Jerusalem, we made crusades to Constantinople too. We burned down when I say we, I mean the British, the Germans, and the French, and so on. So we attacked our own brothers there and burned down the churches and all this. So these are the things which are really depressing, but we do have to see them, and if we are believers, we have to repent them and not to defend them. There is no way to defend this. Then there comes the Protestant Reformation. Now, what a shock that was. Copernicus, went to the Pope and talked about the sun moving and the earth moving around the sun. It was this thing that was the basis of the whole discussion, if that everything down there moves or not. And the Pope had no problems with Copernicus. 70 years later comes Galileo and says exactly the same like Copernicus. And they show him the waterboarding and the torture instruments. What had happened in the meantime was the Reformation. So the Reformation did not reform the church sufficiently. It did to some extent, but it split it. First into 3, and now in 1,200. Is that good or bad? You could say there's many good things have come from that. There would be no modern state without the Reformation. It's questionable if there would be a modern science without the Reformation, if there would be a bourgeois revolution. You cannot have a revolution without a Reformation. If the Reformation would not have taken place, there could not have been a revolution. The third estate, which governs this country, holds this country here, would never have come to the peak. They could never have thrown the clergy out of the nobility. Lord Baltimore was the only nobility who came here, and he stayed only 3 years, and then he ran away back again. This was a bourgeois country from the very beginning and will be it to the very end. So so the Protestant Reformation had good things, but when we discuss here and when Christians discuss, then the judgment must come from the Gospels. And the Gospel, Jesus teaches, be one like the Father and I are one. And I gave that into a speech, I mentioned that in a speech here in K College, and I lost a lot of friends there. So maybe one shouldn't do it if one likes to have friends. So nevertheless, it is true nevertheless. So the question is what we do with this, and the Pope talked about this. Nobody asked, our Protestant friends to come back to Rome and forget their beautiful Lutheran songs and their beautiful Methodist songs and so on. What beautiful Methodists we have down there and so on. So nothing. The question is only, can the patriarchs and can the Archbishop of Canterbury of the Anglican Communion, can they accept the papacy, or the patriarch? If the patriarch, if the Roman Bishop of Rome would say, I am the first among equals, they all would agree. Because already in antiquity, when they had a council in the East, they would always consult the Patriarch of the West so that he would give his okay, because Peter had been there in Rome. That gives him a particular status. But what they don't want to accept, all the others, is I am the first among unequals. Now, hopefully the Pope will find the humility and overcome all arrogance or whatever, and say, I am the first among equals. And right away, the Archbishop of Canterbury will kiss his ring, and so will the patriarchs, and they will say, show him over his shoulder and say, you are the first among us, but we are all equal. And then we would have peace. But they haven't done it. So the last Pope went to Alexandria, and he kissed the Pope. He calls himself Pope too. The others gave it up. The Pope of Alexandria, but the Popes, nothing came from the kissing. Usually the kiss is the beginning of great things, but nothing happened.
Judas.
So the same thing happened also with Canterbury, and nothing happened either. It's not enough to kiss now. It has something to do with what the others can accept. They can accept that Peter was the leader of the group, of the Jesus movement, that Peter came to Rome and he was executed, and then the next bishop came, and now we have 266 bishops. The succession in Rome. So the succession is, they would recognize the succession. There are some holes in it, but I think one can defend it and say it was apostolic. So, but then the question is, does the Pope accept that, the first among equals? Or does he continue to say, you are not equal? because Peter was not in Constantinople, he was not in Moscow, he was not in Alexandria, and so on. So we'll see how far the Pope's panentheism, his all-embracing theology, how far that really goes in praxis. Okay, then just a few things about the Habsburg. You know, these were the head of the Habsburg Empire, Marie-Therese, a good Catholic woman who even was one of two in 1500 years who followed the Augustinian just war theory and didn't make a war. All the others made a war anyway, and everybody had, of course, a just war. All wars were just gangsters from one end to the other. Then was the Ottoman Empire there, which was quite a powerful instrument which went under then after the First World War. And then there was Napoleon Bonaparte, who dragged the Pope over the Alps and then for coronation, and then he took the crown out of his hand and put it on his own head. So that means he humiliated the Pope. And Catholics since then taught that Napoleon was punished for this by freezing in Moscow. So that the failure in Moscow was God's punishment for having humiliated the Pope. Then comes Benito Mussolini. Benito Mussolini recognized the church state, and they did the so-called Lateran Treaty, the first treaty between the fascist state and the Vatican. The church got the little church state there, the few miles that was given to them, and the church rescinded all the other things. They owned, almost half of Italy. The papacy, that was all lost, but at least now they have a little state with a radio station and a little army there who could shoot a little bit and so on. But then Hitler they concorded with Hitler, and then Hitler broke it. And I lived through that, the Catholic Youth Movement. We saw the effects of it and suffered the effects. So then, in spite of the fact that he had a concordat, he wanted to march into it in 1943. When he took over Italy, he wanted to march into the Vatican and took the guy, put him into prison there in Pacelli. And but then the foreign minister, Ribbentrop, persuaded Hitler not to do that. It wouldn't look good. It wouldn't look good in international relations to put the old man into prison. And then there's, of course, Franco and his fascism, all the Catholics, of course, on the fascist side. Then there's the whole issue with Stalin. They never made a treaty with Stalin, of course, but communism, liberalism, Catholicism, and fascism share the hate against socialism. So when even people who thought that Hitler had done horrible things, like my pastor, whatever, they would still say Hitler is the only man who can conquer communism, the atheistic Bolshevism and so on, and therefore they stuck with him. 3 million men, most of them Catholics and all baptized and so on, marched with Hitler into the Soviet Union and killed 27 million Russians. We always talk about 6 million Jews, and we shouldn't forget that, but we should remember the 27 million so-called communists too. So Hitler was a great communist killer, and that is why they made the Concordat and everything else. Then liberalism, that John Paul II got lots of money and gave it to the Solidarity Union in Warsaw, and that's how they tumbled the socialist government, and that had after effects in other socialistic governments. And then after he had supported the neoliberal counter-revolution, then the Pope suddenly started to criticize liberalism and the corporations which now moved into the territory and exploited it from on one end to the other. And there was no state strong enough to regulate these capitalistic characters, and so they exploited the whole thing, and the Pope tried to take a middle position. So he had fought against the communists, but suddenly now the liberals, the capitalists, took over. So he did say things against them, but nobody listened to it. Okay, then socialism, of course, in spite of the fact that Christianity brought this whole thing in the world, not alone, there were also philosophers who were against private property, and we have the texts here. So, but the church then forgot this socialism, and then when they forgot it, then the monks appeared. They said the mainstream Christians had lost Christianity, so they went to Monte Cassino, Benedict, and so on. And here, 3 rivers, we have Anglican Benedictines, who do the exact opposite of what the main culture does, subculture. That means they take the vow of chastity, and we are over sex porno society. They took the vow of obedience against the power maniac business which we have, which we saw in recent days again. And so on. Then money, 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 and the poverty thing, so they take a vow of poverty. So they do the exact opposite of the mainstream society is doing, and think they have some purifying influence, devoted to prayer. And Dustin was visited them today. I go there on Monday. You can go there over the weekend. You don't even have to pay. We pay them anyway with our donations and so on. So, and then they have land. They have land which they rent out, and that's what they live from. Benedictines mean ora et labora. It means pray and work, but they don't work anymore. They pray and then live from wage labor, as they lived before from slavery and before from serfdom, another 1,000 years and so on, which is always the vulnerable thing in the existence of these groups there. They start out after the Buddhists, who always fought against the caste system, but then accepted it anyway. Okay, so, and then, of course, things like clerical child abuse, it has quieted down a little bit. The church is still paying millions and so on. Father Ken is involved in bringing some order into all of this. Father Martin Down is not only the marriage court, but he also is dealing with these things in terms of the courts. But the church is still suffering, has to pay, and may go for years and years. Some dioceses had to sell their churches and land and whatever in order to pay for that. So it was a great catastrophe. But the talks have gone down a little bit, and the whole church-state thing came into the whole thing. The secular courts, of course, asserted their right. The church had its own courts, but they pushed them into the corner and showed their own power in the whole thing. But so it is indeed a deep crisis, but it's not the only one which we have. So nevertheless, the church has survived in spite of everything, and that can give us confidence in a more natural way. It is astonishing what has happened. So also Francis I and his church will survive, probably. And we have to think that Rome, thinks differently from other people. They think differently from states. They think differently from businessmen. They have a completely different time perspective. Let me say for a moment what a conservative cardinal, how he sees things there in the Roman way. They went through the collapse of the Roman civilization. It lasted 500 years, the collapse, and was the Dark Ages, from 500 to 1000. Then they saw the medieval order in the 15th, 16th century. The whole medieval order, in which they were really dominant, just collapsed, the whole thing, and modernity arose out of it. Now they see another decline. Firstly, our falling apart of the families, the high divorce rate, the high rate of abortions, and so on. All that is not normal. So, but they think it is just another transition from modernity to postmodernity. And in this time, then you have homosexual, they all come out of the closet. Everybody comes out of the closet and so on. So therefore, they have some kind of a distant thing. If the Pope says, by the way, one characteristic is he doesn't like to talk to masses of people, masses. He wants to talk to one person at a time. And they have invented some kind of a trick when he talks that he can have the feeling that he just talks to one person. I don't know what the technology is about it, but what he sees in front of him is just one person. Then he talks as if there was just one person. And that is something beautiful in a certain sense. So that he can take this whole into consideration, in his panentheism, but that at the same time, he has that feeling for the suffering of that individual person, and that God's providence is at work in this homosexual person, in this divorced person, in this person who had to have an abortion, and so on. And who is he to say what God's providence is doing in the life of this person? And that, I think, is quite a healthy type of an attitude. Okay, so that is what we want to say today. the culture wars are going on, and we will have a lot of opportunity to see what the Pope will, what position he will take. And I would say that he will not change, the fundamental norms. I think he cannot, some of them are dogma, and he cannot do anything about that. But others, he may think that it needs time and so on. But his overall view is as good as it can be at this time, and I think one can be very happy about this. So the culture war, which is raging on from day to day here, you just turn the television on and you have another thing, another state which wants to have gay marriage, and then a gay union, and then the next day they want to have gay marriage, which is another step, and so on. And it cannot be stopped. And it happened in Belgium before, in Holland before, so it happens all over the place. The last, he said that the last Pope, resigned, and this one thinks that this was a great deed, and I would agree with this. It took courage that he saw that he couldn't handle anymore, that his paradigm was run out and something else had to be found. And he went to Africa, and the last Pope, and said strange things about birth control and AIDS, and it upset everybody. So now to say don't concentrate just on this birth control thing, think the whole picture, relax about the whole thing, let God work in things that can bring a more healthy situation. Sometimes when one is in illness, you don't even know how sick one is. So it is a sick situation. So nevertheless, all these culture war issues, the abortion and so on and so on and so on, he will say we should not be obsessed by them and should see that there are higher values which must under no circumstance be violated when we deal with all these other things. So, okay, so that is number 2 there, and we want to stop with that. Do we have a few minutes for our movie still? Mm-hmm. A few pictures of Romero. Why Romero? Because Romero and the present Pope, they both come from this Latin American world. They had all these fascist dictators there. They faced the same thing. If the Pope was brave enough, can be doubted in the meantime. He was not killed like Romero because he did not oppose fascism like Romero did. But nobody can be judgmental. I lived under fascism, and I know how fearful and how horrible that can be. And so nobody should sit in judgment about the Pope that he maybe didn't do enough for his priests and all this. So we should take it into consideration and should say what should be done in the future about that when fascism comes, which is possible in this country as well. As a matter of fact, I came here not in order to get rich. That was not the purpose and has not been achieved, but rather to prevent under all circumstances that this country does what Weimar did and so on. What you see going on in the government and so on is very, very dangerous in that sense. So that is where the Church hopefully will take the right side and not support these fascist tendencies, particularly as Catholic mass culture is concerned. There are Catholic Tea Party people, and it's very hard to persuade them sometimes. So, but we must prevent that. If fascism in a small country like Germany could do this for the global community, you can imagine what that will do if we move there. So, and it would be overnight. When I grew up, fascism, from liberalism to fascism, was a few months. Then I was sent back in order to bring fascism to liberalism again. It took us just a few months. It means a few laws, and if you have enough authoritarian personalities around, it takes nothing. You can do it all in the name of freedom and whatever. So it is a real danger, because fascism is the most adequate political form for a capitalistic system. And therefore the danger is always there. So that is another question where this Pope will stand, if he will take the fascist side or if he will take the other side. And we don't have a good record there, because we were allied with fascism through many, many decades. Prepared practically by 100 years, because a Spanish diplomat, after the kings had been removed by the Third Estate, the diplomat said the kings will have to be replaced by dictators, and they will be dictators who come from heaven, and he meant bourgeois dictators like Hitler and Mussolini and so on, and then there will be dictators who come from hell, and these are people like Stalin and so on. So he recommended, and the church followed this thinking, so that when the bourgeois dictators came, because of the socialistic dictators had come, they took the side of the bourgeois dictators. Hitler was a Catholic, Goebbels was a Catholic, Goering a Protestant, Himmler was a Catholic. They were all Catholics. And all these 3 million, half of them at least, were Catholics, and they were all baptized, and they all marched with him and killed and murdered and so on. So particularly when things get chaotic in Parliament or in Congress, as it was in recent months, that's very dangerous, because then these people come and say, it doesn't work, and they have something in their head, some paradigm, and they say, health insurance doesn't work. They haven't seen it, it hasn't really started yet. But they deduct from what they have in their head. They deduct it cannot work because it ought not to work, because the world must be unequal. Some should have health insurance, the others should not have health insurance. They had health insurance in order to discipline the masses. Liberalism is a form of, it comes from Protestantism, so it's the original sin. People are lazy. So you connect health insurance with a job, and that is a great motivation. If you are not obedient, you are not productive, you don't produce surplus value, then you have no health insurance. Then you will die. And that motivates. Or you will be thrown in the slums. 40 million are there. So that is how they discipline the masses. And so this is a great experiment which was made here in this country, and we must be aware, that is an experiment, and there's no guarantee that it will work. The Constitution is great. It's a wonderful instrument which the encyclopedists produced, not the guys in Philadelphia. They were all educated there. So, and it was a great document, but in the meantime, civil society has split in such a way in terms of classes, and has become so huge that the Constitution is not sufficient any longer. So we need a constitutional assembly, but under the conditions of that split in the Republican Party, that would be dangerous, that would be deadly. It cannot be done now. So, well, these are the broader perspectives, and when we ask what this prophetic function of the Pope should be in the next years or so, those problems will come up.